They declared the site empty. No one who entered ever returned. Viewer discretion. This episode discusses disappearances and long, unresolved investigations. Some details may be unsettling. When you say a place is empty, what do you mean? An empty room, a deserted stretch of road, a property stamped abandoned on a city file. In these stories, empty takes on other meanings. A pub where the last laugh died on a night of celebration, a fourth-floor flat that outwardly looks untouched though time has passed, a short trail where a child stepped off and vanished into silence. Each site tied to a person who did not come back. Each site in its own way declared empty. By law, by abandonment, by absence, or by the finality of what was found there. The emptiness becomes its own evidence. It becomes the question. The first case begins on a summer night of flags and noise. June 2006, Paderborn, Germany. The city was alive with the World Cup. Streets were full of strangers laughing as if the world had been momentarily reassembled around a ball. In that tide of celebration was a 21-year-old nursing student named Frauke. She was ordinary in ways that matter most, studying, sharing an apartment with roommates, laughing with friends at a pub late into the night. She planned to walk home. Her last confirmed plans were banal. She texted. She called. She rode in the ordinary rhythms of young adult life that feel safe until they unravel. It was a night that should have become an anecdote, a late train, a missed bus, an apologetic text the next day, and never this long aching gap that would open in the months to follow. What makes the name Frauke Liebs persist in cold case circles is how quickly the mundane tipped into the inexplicable. In the hours after she disappeared, her phone became a series of riddles. A terse text arrived that was not from any known friend. The single word, Nieheim. That town is roughly 35 kilometers from Paderborn. There was no reason for her to be there that night. The text arrived at a time when the city was loud with celebration, and when travel would have required planning. Then came the calls. Not the long reconnections we imagine when someone tries to explain later that they were lost. These were short, monitored contacts, calls that suggested someone was on the other end listening and prompting. Her ex-boyfriend Chris got calls that pinged from industrial zones beyond the ring of suburbs. Pings that placed the signal briefly, in places without cozy explanations. It is a detail that investigators would later return to. The calls behaved like someone's phone. Her phone being moved through areas that had nothing to do with a direct route home. On one of those calls, something quieter and more terrible happened. Frauke's sister had asked plainly whether she was okay. The voice on the line whispered at first, yes. Then it shifted, a contradiction, a stifled correction. The line went dead. That brief exchange, a fragment of consent followed by ambiguity, would be replayed in interviews and in the memory of a family trying to accept the simplest of truths. Maybe that whisper was the last time she used her voice in the world. Police worked the geographic traces that modern investigations often hinge upon. Cell tower pings, triangulation, the sequence of short calls. The pattern suggested supervision. Investigators raised the possibility that Frauke's calls were being made under the watch of someone who was nearby, directing what she could say. That hypothesis was not a conclusion. It was an attempt to explain behavior that did not fit a neat map of freedom and choice. The human side of the search is the part that never fits in a report. Over 900 people were questioned. Friends, acquaintances, strangers who had been in the general area that night. Interviews stretched across days and weeks as police tried to parse contradictions from grief. The family made statements that were alternately hopeful and flattened by fear. A mother set out a memorial that, for years, was a place to gather memory and to resist forgetting, until in 2023 she quietly took it down. Sometimes closure looks like the end of an era of public mourning. Sometimes it looks like a private decision about how to hold absence. 3 months later, a body was found. It was not in a tidy location. It was in a place with a name that sounds like a threshold of finality. Totengrund. The dump site lay in a wooded hollow, an area used for disposal, an unglamorous seam of land between commuting routes and scrub. The remains were skeletonized. The forensic picture was stark and unadorned. Time had done what time does, erasing soft detail, leaving bones and a few recalcitrant traces. Clothing was there. Almost nothing else was. No bag, no purse, no phone. Only an unknown small cross survived among the remnants, a single stubborn object that refused to give a story. It is tempting to conflate location and meaning. Totengrund was, in practical terms, a place for trash. Yet after the discovery, it read like a punctuation mark in the narrative, a site that took in and held what others discarded. It was not an evidentiary conclusion. It was a bitterly ironic setting for a young woman who had last been seen elsewhere. The site itself had no witness to the moment she arrived there. It was only where the remains were later recovered. Investigators stressed that recovery location does not always equal death location. But for her family, Totengrund became the physical point where the search for answers met the cold finality of a discovery. Investigations in such cases often circle around what can be proved and what must remain hypothesis. For Frauke, the biology of her remains could not tell the whole story. Forensic specialists can estimate time of death ranges and examine bone trauma, but they cannot by themselves map intent. They cannot speak to the human choices that preceded the bones. Who had her last moments, where she was taken, whether she was with someone she trusted or with someone who had hidden themselves in plain view. That unknown cross. Is it a clue? Or is it a relic that has nothing to do with the act that preceded death? Investigators cataloged everything and treated nothing as conclusive unless corroborated. There were other small frustrations that dug at the edges of the case. The missing items. Why would so little of a young woman's personal effects be present? How had a body come to rest where it did? The answers were not forthcoming. Families who have waited a short time for answers speak of the agony of silence. Families who wait decades inhabit a different terrain of pain, one mapped by legal forms, investigators' rotating shifts, and the grinding plod of time. For Frauke's mother, the persistence of not knowing became a way of life, an agonizing rhythm of public appeals intercut with private grief. In court of public opinion, unsolved cases accumulate their own rumors and theories. Here, in our narration, we will not traffic in accusation without evidence. There is no verified perpetrator for Frauke's disappearance and death. There are only traces and conjecture. One theory suggests the calls were controlled. Another wonders if someone she knew carried out an act that left no public trace. Investigators continued to pursue leads, to revisit phone logs, to comb through witness statements. But after so much effort, the essential question remained. Who turned a lively, ordinary night into a life whose last chapter was written in the absence of witnesses? There is a kind of spatial loneliness to Totengrund that matters to this theme. It is a place where refuse accumulates. It is a site people enter to dispose of things they no longer want, then leave. To say a site is declared empty, in Frauke's story, is to point to the way ordinary places can become repositories for the final and unreadable evidence of a life. The emptiness was not simply the absence of people, it was the absence of explanation. It was the silence of the land when the voices that might explain what happened were already gone. The nights after her disappearance pulsed with a different kind of noise. Media reports, police appeals, neighbors' speculation. The more time passed, the more the public shifted from shock to a more muted, persistent wondering. People who had been at the pub, who had shared a cigarette or a song, were asked to recall sequences in microscopic detail. Memory is unreliable and terrible for the families who require it to be perfect. Investigators must take what they can get. Sometimes the only tangible clue is the absence itself, the last confirmed message, the last call, the last place she was seen. Those are the lodestars around which searching orbits. A final detail in Frauke's file that many commentators note is the unknown cross found among her clothing. It is the kind of thing strangers fixate on because it is specific. It is an object that invites narrative. Was it a gift? A token? Something picked up along a path? The cross has no firm provenance in the public record. It resists story because it can be both a relic and a red herring. For the family, however, objects like that become part of the fabric of mourning, small anchors that keep memory from drifting entirely into a void. After the discovery, there was an inundation of interviews and articles. There were appeals for anyone who might remember trivia that, in hindsight, looks like it could have been evidence. None produced the answer. Police did what the system allows. They build a case from corroborated statements and material facts. They conduct forensic analysis. They pursue leads. They close chapters of the operation and sometimes reopen others when new information, even decades later, surfaces. In the public eye, the story took on the shape of a cautionary tale. In the private view, for a mother, for siblings, for friends, it remained a raw, open wound. For our title's purposes, there is a resonance here beyond the literal. The dump where Frock was found is a kind of physical empty, a receptacle where things end up and belong to no one. But the site that was truly declared empty in this story is the one no one could enter to tell what happened. People could stand around it, speculate where the author of the act might have gone, but no one could cross the threshold into the last moments of her life. The silence was territorial, a private experience that the public could not breach. If you're new here and you follow our deep dives into disappearances and unsolved mysteries, consider subscribing. We work through facts and timelines carefully. We respect the people involved. We avoid speculation dressed up as truth. If these cases matter to you, stick around. There is more ahead. The second story brings us to a different kind of emptiness. Not the aftermath of a violent night, but the slow institutional erasure of a life. Zagreb, Croatia. A small fourth-floor apartment in a building where neighbors had built lives that sometimes brushed and sometimes passed each other by. In the apartment lived Hedviga Golik, an elderly woman described by those who knew her as reclusive, eccentric, and solitary. She wasn't the kind of person who drew attention to herself. She preferred the edges of social life. Neighbors saw her leave seldom and complained sometimes that she was an odd presence they did not understand. This is the kind of disappearance that is hard to notice until it is almost too late. People stop appearing in the routines that confirm existence. No more shopping trips, no more shadows behind a lace curtain. Over months and years, routines harden into absence. For Hedviga, that absence metastasized into a strange administrative process. Records and tenant testimony suggest a layered neglect. An apartment can become, legally, someone else's problem when bills pile up and no one answers notices. In Hedviga's case, the flat was formally declared abandoned in the early 1990s, mid-1991, according to some records. Tenants reported a notice in 1998 that warned anyone who entered that they could be prosecuted. That notice was, for years, a kind of protective talisman. It kept people away. It also complicated matters for those who shared the building and who were tempted by curiosity or by the practical needs of reclaiming space. There are several strange administrative details that do not resolve neatly. An architect, a neighbor with more money or responsibility than most, reportedly paid the electricity for the apartment for years. Who arranged that, and why? It suggests someone wanted the outward signs of habitation maintained, while the inside was not observed. Then there is the alleged Census Commission notice, an official-looking warning that discouraged entry and claimed legal authority over who could step over the threshold. Representatives of the commission later denied posting such a notice. That denial changes the tone of the record. Either someone used official-sounding language to frighten people away, or memory and bureaucratic paper trails diverged. Neighbors told different versions of what they thought they'd seen over the decades. Some said they glimpsed lights, a figure moving, the kettle on at odd hours. Others said the curtains never opened. People rationalized, they assumed. For a building full of lives that continue in their separate channels, an unexamined apartment is the sort of thing neighbors accept until circumstances compel them to act. Another pattern emerges here that we see across many neglected cases. When an administrative label is applied, abandoned, unclaimed, vacant, it can do the work of erasing urgency. It provides a bureaucratic cover that allows an apartment to sit, legally, in a kind of limbo. Utilities may be maintained, bills may be paid by a third party, notices might be posted. The human being who once animated that space becomes a footnote in a ledger. To say the site was declared empty is literal here. Legal declarations and notices created a boundary that discouraged intrusion. Whether that boundary preserved dignity or masked tragedy is the question. For years, the flat remained an unopened book to a community. Tenants pooled money to settle debts and to avoid unpleasant surprises like sudden cutoffs. The sense among neighbors was not of conspiracy but of inertia, a series of small acts, notices posted, an architect paying bills, a census commission denial, created a fence around the truth. Over a long stretch of time, the apartment ceased to be a place people crossed into. The legal posture was, do not enter. The informal posture was, leave it be. What happens when an entire living space can be legally untouched for decades? What happens to the record of a person inside it? Forensic science can later answer questions about cause or time of death, but it cannot reweave the social fabric that allowed a life to fade out of communal recognition. That social silence becomes part of the mystery itself. Tenants in the building describe practical reasons for not forcing entry. Fear of prosecution loomed. There was distrust about handling somebody else's private property, and yet, the human need to resolve the unknown eventually grows harder to resist. People grow tired of stories that hang in the air. They grow tired of the questions that get asked in downstairs conversations but never answered. In many buildings, someone finally takes a decisive step. They escalate a complaint. They call city services. They gather the will and the money to act. Years would pass in Hedviga's case while the apartment sat protected by a mesh of rules and denials. The building's residents saw themselves not as detectives, but as people trying to live ordinary lives. Still, their lives were punctured by curiosity, by the ethical weight of neglect, by whatever shadow hung behind that closed door. In a sense, the site had been declared empty by administrative fiat and by community acquiescence. It had become off-limits not only to entry but to the kinds of communal concern that might have rescued a life or, at the very least, answered a question. And then there was the decision to act. The timeline of who decided and when is scattered across tenant testimonies. Tenants pooled resources. Someone collected money. Someone said the unpaid debts needed settling. Someone determined that the warnings, however official they appeared, were a barrier to human decency. They agreed to force entry, to break the boundary that had protected the apartment from scrutiny for decades. It is at this point that the story stands at an axis. A place that was declared empty, by declaration, by neglect, by social consensus, is about to be violated in the name of truth. The tenants prepare to do the work that bureaucracy and denial left undone. They hope for a tidy resolution. They expect, perhaps, to find a mess, to clear out the hoarding of an eccentric life, to return the apartment to circulation. But there is an aspect here that will hang over everything we are about to tell. Sometimes the simplest act of opening a door is a revelation of how wrong our assumptions were. The apartment had been treated as an administrative absence. But administrative absence is not the same as actual absence. The moment of forcing the door may solve a practical problem, but what it may uncover could be far more complex than anyone in the building anticipated. They forced the door years later, and what they found inside would force the city to rewrite its assumptions about neglect and presence. They forced the door years later, and what they found inside forced the city to rewrite its assumptions about neglect and presence. The door gave under the weight of a shared decision. It was not an act of heroism so much as the late-stage impatience of neighbors who had grown tired of a closed story. When the lock splintered and the apartment breathed open, the building's ordinary hum shifted into the register of emergency. Someone called the police. Someone else held back from looking too long. The room smelled faintly of tea, and of the particular stillness that belongs to places where time has stopped moving for one life, but not for the world outside. There in a chair sat Hedviga Golik. She was not recent in the way a sleeping person is recent. She was preserved in a manner that made the scene feel like a domestic tableau left in the middle of a day. A cup of tea sat near her within reach. The windows were open. The electricity was on. For decades, according to the medical examiner's assessment, she had not breathed. The examiner later estimated that her death likely dated back decades rather than years, an interval that stretched the meaning of absence into something bureaucratic and moral. Police and forensic teams moved through the flat with the quiet efficiency that follows an unexpected death. Technicians photographed the room, logged the teacup, recorded the state of the curtains, the placement of furniture, the position of Hedviga's body. They collected what physical evidence remained and, where possible, took testimony from the tenants who had forced the door. The official file would later note the odd administrative traces that had allowed this state to persist. Records showing the apartment had been declared abandoned in the early 1990s. Accounts from neighbors of a notice posted in 1998 warning against entering. A shadowy arrangement in which an architect, not a relative by all appearances, had paid the flat's electricity for years. Those administrative facts do not explain why a human life could be reduced to ledger entries and a cup of tea. They do, however, explain how a place can become legally and socially empty long before it becomes physically vacant. In Hedviga's case, the emptiness was literal and procedural. A notice hung in a stairwell. The threat of prosecution dissuaded entry. Third parties handled bills. The community accepted the boundary. For a long time, the flat was an envelope marked, "Do not open." That envelope contained a person. There were immediate questions that could not be avoided. Who had placed the notices? Who had arranged for the utilities to continue? Why did neighbors defer for so long? Some of these questions had documentary footprints. Others dissolved into conflicting memories. Neighbors remembered seeing lights at odd hours. Others swore the curtains were never drawn. A census office representative later denied posting the warning that tenants recalled. That denial did not itself answer why an architect would cover a utility bill, or why the apartment's administrator remained, for years, a mystery. Investigators treated the administrative discrepancies with the care of professionals who know how paperwork can both reveal and conceal. They looked for signatures. They traced payments. They sought to match telephone numbers and service records to named individuals. In several instances, the trail led to dead ends. In others, it suggested gaps where acts of civic responsibility should have occurred, but did not. There was no evidence in the public record, at least none available in the sources, that the denial by a commission led to criminal charges. The building's tenants later said they had felt trapped between legal caution and human conscience. Better to leave well enough alone, they told themselves, until the accumulation of facts made it impossible to continue doing nothing. The scene inside Hedviga's apartment felt cruelly domestic. Small, meaningless details. A tea towel hung over a chair, a kettle on a counter, the angle of a magazine. Read like punctuation marks in a sentence that had been cut. For the people who opened that door, the moment of finding her was not cinematic. It was medicine, shock, paperwork, practical calls to authorities. It was also shame for many who had come to feel complicit by omission. Those conversations between neighbors, the we should and the we can't, are part of what allowed a life to be administratively erased. When the autopsy returned its estimate, decades had passed. It created a particular kind of moral weather. People could be angry at the system, at the notices, at the paperwork, or at the fog of human indifference. They could also be left with the quieter grief of imagining what Hedviga's last conscious hours might have been like. The external facts could not reconstruct her interior life. They could only show how social procedures had allowed a human being to remain behind a legal line that said, effectively, "This is empty." Here the title of our investigation takes on a literal hue. In Zagreb, for Hedviga, the site was formally declared empty by procedures and notices. Those legal markers did the work of sealing off a life. That sealing, official, administrative, bureaucratic, enabled a reality in which a body could be present and still be, in records and in neighbors' minds, absent. It is a rare and extreme example of how law and habit can render people invisible. The aftermath of discovery brought investigations, apologies, and records. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes now gave statements. City officials reviewed their procedures. Families of other tenants relived tensions about property and privacy. The flat, once sealed by an implied decree, became an object lesson in communal responsibility. And yet even in the reshuffling of blame and regret, many of the peculiar administrative questions remained. Who had posted the notice, and why did a public office disavow having done so? Who, and with what authority, had kept the outward signs of habitation while the inward truth was allowed to ossify? There are moments in investigation when an answer is withheld, not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence is administrative rather than criminal. Hedviga's case is one of those moments. The legal fiction of vacancy had been maintained while the human fact of presence persisted. It is a linguistic inversion that takes on monstrous poignancy when you think of a cup of tea left untouched on a small table. The cup does not explain itself. The cup only asks why the world outside chose not to enter. We leave Hedviga's apartment with a sense that emptiness can be declared by others, by notices, by invoices, by people who prefer not to intrude. In this case, the declaration was literal. In the other stories we will examine, the declaration is more metaphorical. That difference matters because it shapes how investigators, families, and communities respond. Another mini-hook. One kind of silence is paper-made. Another is the sound of a small child stepping into nothing. June 25, 1983. Elkhorn Park, Montana. A family picnic, ham radio operators gathered, children running along a short, familiar path. 4-year-old Nylene K. Briscoe walked with the confidence of a child at play. Her disappearance lasted the length of a heartbeat and then unfurled into a search that would occupy thousands. The initial response to Nylene's vanishing was enormous. Community volunteers gathered in force. Neighbors, ranchers, law enforcement, air search teams, trackers, and families all turned their attention to the park and the surrounding brush. According to records and contemporary reporting, more than 2,500 people became involved in the early hunt. For 10 days the terrain was combed. Ponds, ravines, caves, even old mine shafts were inspected. Dogs worked tirelessly. The world of the search took on its own rhythm. The repetition of calls, the shifting grid overlays, the weary faces of volunteers who refused to let the light go out on a promise to a child's mother. Despite the scale and the intensity, there was no physical trace, there was not even a shoe. The absence was total in the way an absence of light can be total. Something that should have left a mark left none. That lack of evidence transformed the park into a kind of negative space. The path where children had run became a sealed memory for locals. It was, in social terms, declared empty, not by law, but by absence, by the fact that searchers found nothing to bring back. 2 years after Nylene's disappearance, a stranger began to write. Letters and phone calls arrived from a man who claimed both responsibility and care. He said he had taken the girl and that she was safe with him. One of the communications contained details not publicly known, facts that, according to investigators, suggested an insider's knowledge about the case. The content gave the correspondence an eerie credibility in the eyes of those who read it. But credibility did not equate to verification. Phone calls and letters were traced to various points. Some tips linked to phone booths in Wisconsin. Others remained untraceable. The man's identity was never conclusively established in the public record. The presence of these communications created a new kind of tether between truth and speculation. For Nylene's mother, Nancy, the letters were both balm and poison, a hope that someone held the child, and an added layer of torment because the claims could not be proven. The case was later featured on a national television program, bringing new tips and renewed publicity. The program amplified the story, but did not provide resolution. Over the decades, leads surfaced and faded. Sightings were reported and followed up. Names were suggested and dismissed. Investigators publicly entertained multiple theories: that the abductor was a stranger, that an acquaintance had removed the child, that the communications were hoaxes. Records show that none of these resulted in a prosecutable case with confirmed outcomes available to the public. The absence of a definitive path from evidence to judgment meant the park remained an emblem of unanswered possibility. There is a particular cruelty to child disappearances that never fully resolves. They demand explanations from the world, and often receive only conjecture. For the community, the park did not become a literal sealed zone in legal terms. It became instead a site of memory and dread that people avoided in quiet ways. Parents rerouted playdates. Picnics shifted locations. Every time a child wandered off, there was the nervous reflex that emerges when memory and fear overlap. These 3 cases, Frauke, Hedviga, Nylene, show different mechanisms by which a place becomes empty. In Frauke's instance, A dump called Totengrund became the physical location where a life was registered as ended. The site collected her remains like refuse without offering answers. In Hedviga's case, administrative processes and communal inertia produced a legally empty space that nevertheless contained a human presence. In Nylene's story, the park was emptied by absence itself. Thorough searches revealed nothing, and later communications muddied the certainty of closure. What ties them together is not the neatness of explanation, but the way silence functions as a presence. Silence can be a witness. It can be an erasure. It can be a kind of boundary that divides the known from the unknowable. These cases show that declared empty can be a legal stamp, an outcome of abandonment, the practical result of a body recovered in a place few will retrace, or the long bruise left by a missing child who generates only conjecture. We should be careful about language. When I say declared empty, I mean different things in each case. In Zagreb, that phrase is literal. Notices and administrative records created a boundary that discouraged entry. In Paderborn and in the Montana Park, the declaration is more figurative. Spaces became empty of explanation, empty of evidence, empty of the people who had once animated them. Where facts can be stated precisely, we have stated them. Where records are ambiguous, we have noted the ambiguity. We have not assigned guilt where none has been proven. We have not filled silences with accusations. There is also a human register that numbers and dates cannot carry. Behind each site are stories of people trying to live with absence. Fraka's mother built and later removed a memorial. Tenants in Zagreb wrestled with questions of duty and fear. Nylene's family lived for years with a public and private longing for answers, a longing that was never neatly satisfied. Loss in these cases is not a single point in time. It is a long, folding process that touches friends, neighbors, authorities, and entire communities. Investigations, too, have limits. Forensic science has its powerful contributions, but it cannot reconstruct motive or fill the ethical gaps in social responses. Administrative systems can designate a place as vacant, but they are poor at detecting the way human lives can be overlooked inside forms and notices. Media interest can sustain a case for a season, sometimes prompting leads. Sometimes it fades. Sometimes it reawakens. Law enforcement agencies continue to accept tips and to examine evidence as new technologies or new witness statements appear. Cold cases sometimes reopen. Sometimes they do not. If you are listening and thinking about these stories, there are a few practical realities to remember. First, nothing is solved by rumor. If you believe you have information about any of these cases, contact the appropriate law enforcement agency, rather than publishing allegations on social media. Second, families who live with unresolved grief are people first. They deserve privacy and dignity. Third, the phrase, "site declared empty," is not an explanation. It is an invitation to look more closely at how societies decide who gets looked after and who is allowed to fade. Before we close, a note about the way we handle these narratives. We use facts where they exist, and mark uncertainty where they do not. The questions raised by these cases are uncomfortable precisely because they point to institutional and communal shortcomings as much as to criminal mysteries. The silence is a puzzle piece that sometimes fits into larger structures of neglect, oversight, or malice, and sometimes it does not. Our job as chroniclers is to hold those tensions without collapsing them into easy answers. They declared the site empty, in one case by notice, in another by neglect, elsewhere by absence. In each instance, a life stopped being present in the way communities expect, visible, accounted for, and grievable within public rituals. The sites remained. A dump called Totengrund where a young woman's remains were found, an apartment left legally untouched while a person within it faded into the records, a park where a child's disappearance refused to yield a trace. Each site holds a different kind of silence, and each silence asks us to consider what we owe one another in vigilance and care. If these stories resonate with you, you'll find the sources we used in the description below. If you want to support further investigations, links to Patreon and other ways to help are also listed there. And a final important plea. If you know anything about any of these cases that could help an investigation, please contact the local authorities handling the matter. Do not rely on hearsay. Let professionals assess and act. Thank you for listening carefully. We respect the families and communities who live with these questions every day. If you want more deep dives into unresolved disappearances and the sites that hold them, check the description for sources and for ways to support the channel. Until next time, keep looking, not to feed curiosity, but to keep the light on for those who still wait.